So forensics, this is the task, if it'll move on. So first task is a timeline, and the second task is a report. The timeline is basically the key events in the history of forensic science. I produced a video on that, but it's just, anything that has led to people being able to apprehend criminals more easily. So, the very first fingerprint, when was that taken? The very first photograph, the very first DNA evidence and things like that. But I'll go through the criteria in a little bit more detail. The second task is a report based on a crime scene. So the idea of it is that you'll write a report as if you've been investigating a crime. Pretty much the only difference with a report for me is it's got titles. So you'll put a title for maybe each criteria or something like that. And the idea is that it will be based on a case. So there's a scenario, a bit of a daft scenario on the assignment brief, or you could actually use a real case. So as you're discussing each thing, you can say, well, in relation to this case, this is what happened, and this is what they didn't do or did do. Okay, you don't have to do that for everything, but if you think about one of the criteria is something like, how do you protect the material at the crime scene, right? Colin Pitchfork case, he lied and got someone else to take his DNA test. Clearly that's not protecting the DNA, is it? Okay, so you can use that case as an example of that criteria. Okay, you don't have to do that for everything, and it can be hypothetical things. But obviously, if you're picking a case, it's got to be a relatively modern one if you're going to talk about things like DNA. Yeah, so it just goes through each step, but each step just corresponds to one of the criteria. Okay? So methods of evidence, examination at crime scenes, and how potential evidence is protected is 1.2. Okay? Right, so that's criteria. And then we'll go through each one in turn. So obviously 1.1 is the timeline, and then everything else is the report. For the report, obviously, you could just take a title from each of the criteria. So the precautions used to protect forensic evidence at a crime scene can be one of your titles. So 1.1. Describe key historical milestones in the development of forensic science. So I was incorrect before, actually. It's not identify, it's describe. So you might want to just align for each thing. How does that relate to forensic science? So I made a video on it. It's on YouTube, and it's gone viral. So, you can watch that. There's been about 17 views or something like that. What are the key changes that have occurred? So it could be things like first use of a fingerprint, the very first photograph, the first DNA profile, things like that.
You're putting in about blood types and all that.
Into that, you could do, but you don't have to, because you could link that in the report because it's part of the report's criteria. Because obviously the development of blood groups was a historical milestone in the development of forensic science. But you wouldn't need to do that in there because you're already going to do it in the report. Yeah, so to make it more simple as an answer to your question, no. So 1.2, explain the precautions used to protect forensic evidence at a crime scene. So you've got your SOCOs, scene of crime officers. They're the people who gather the evidence at the crime scene. You might want to make sure that the scene is cordoned off. I guess it makes me think of is it Nicola Bulley? Yeah, the Nicola Bulley case, and we were talking about that and things. Chain of custody. Is it being kept safe at every step? The evidence. The collection and storage of the evidence in inappropriate packaging. Just anything you would do, or not do, to protect evidence at a crime scene. As I said, you can use a case as you go through. So, if you were mentioning the Nicola Bulley case, you could say, it's really important to cordon off a crime scene. In some instances, they do not do that effectively, and, that is why crimes are harder to solve. In the case of Nicola Bulley, in the case of O.J. Simpson, I remember as well, they basically messed up the evidence, and therefore they weren't able to use it to convict him. So yeah, that's pretty straightforward, that one. 1.3, evaluate the use of modern technology in the collection and analysis of forensic evidence. So in this case, I would kind of make this go through all the way. Yeah. So you could do this as a kind of succinct and separate title, or it could be something that follows all the way through. Because obviously if you're talking about fingerprinting, that's to do with technology. If you're talking about DNA, that's to do with technology. But remember the word evaluation. What are the pros and cons? So that was a key, I think, from the last assignment as well. If it says evaluation, you need to make sure that you're doing for and against. And then you come to a conclusion. How good is the evidence? How good is that thing? So what kind of technology is used? So you've got things like electrophoresis and PCR testing of DNA, DNA databases, fingerprint scanners and analysis. The system is called IDENT1. Collection of material, for example, alternative light sources and scanners and things like that, and even things like facial recognition. Okay, so what are the pros and cons of using those things? Obviously, a pro is that it's easier. The evidence is more at your fingertips, if you like, and it probably results in more convictions and more stringent evidence. But on the other hand, I'm thinking about things like ethical issues as well, in relation to having people's DNA on file and people's fingerprints on file, and facial recognition scanners are being controversial. (2.1) Describe the principles of fingerprint collection at a crime scene and from suspects. So it's basically how do you do it. So formally we used things like powders and ink. Then we analysed it by eye. So obviously in the past it was very kind of manual, the process. And we watched that guy from Liverpool, John Moores, didn't we, doing the whole ink process. Based on the work of Galton and Henry, who developed that system of loops, walls and arches. A lot of the time now it's done using computers, stored on a database, and then you can scan through that database. As I said, it's called IDENT1. And then, with reference to traditional and modern approaches, explain the principles and reliability of fingerprint matching. So, is fingerprinting a reliable method? Yes and no is obviously the answer. It was formerly much more difficult, so by eye, very laborious. Also, you had human error. And human error can still be there, can't it? You can take a fingerprint incorrectly so that people can't see it as well. It's now much easier, almost instantaneous. So that guy was saying how you entered the fingerprint into the database and it instantaneously could tell you if there's any matches. Fingerprints are essentially unique, even in identical twins. And then you've got the issue have you got a fingerprint? How many have you got? Was it collected appropriately? How clear is it? And then blood groups. So evaluate the use of blood groups in the identification of potential suspects. Again, I'll be explaining what they are and why or why not the system is good at identifying people. So you've got the ABO system, antibodies, antigens, RH factor, is it negative or positive? is this a good system? But it does help in the process of elimination. You know, if you've got a suspect who's A positive and you've got a sample that's A positive, it suggests that it's more likely that it was them. But it's only class evidence. So it can't tell you an individual person. It only says that they belong to a certain group of people. And then, very simple one, identify potential sources of DNA that might be found at a crime scene. So those are some: blood, semen, urine, sweat, etc. If anything ever says identify, you don't actually need to do anything else apart from just name those things, and then you met the criteria. So that's a way to save words. And you don't even, obviously you don't need to do a title for that, you can just do it as you're going through.
We've got a reference each of these back to a specific crime.
You don't have to reference each of them back to a specific crime scene, but if you make some links to it, because it'll be quite good evidence on it and good application to a proper case. Yeah? 3.3. Sorry, it's a 15-minute max, so we've got 12 minutes. Describe the production of DNA profile from biological material. How is a profile produced? So this guy called Alec Jeffreys invented the first DNA fingerprints. And basically, it's a process to compare small parts of DNA that are different between people. Okay, most of our DNA is identical, but he developed this system by which you can compare the little bits of DNA that are not identical between people to match that person or that sample to an actual individual person. It used a process called PCR to copy what's called short tandem repeats in someone's DNA, and then electrophoresis to visualize them and compare to others. So you've got these repeated codes that exist in people's DNA, and you can literally match it to another sample. And it uses PCR to copy them and electrophoresis so you can see them, and then you can compare the samples. The very first time that happened was in the Colin Pitchfork case in 1987. And obviously that's a case that you can use, isn't it? You know, and just so you're aware, you don't need to know everything about the case. You can make it up, can't you? You know, you can say, this is what they should have done to protect the crime scene. Right? You might not know, or you might not be able to find out those things because they don't always publish everything about a crime scene because it's, you know, except for when no, I'm not going to make that joke because this is going on YouTube. Explain the use and reliability of DNA profiles in the elimination of suspects and conviction of criminals. How is it used? There's a DNA database. You know, that's controversial in itself, isn't it? Should the government be able to, should the police be able to take our DNA and keep it on file? Is it reliable? Well, yeah, because DNA evidence is unique to a person. It's much more sensitive as well, the process nowadays, so you can do it on much more fragile samples. However, no. Is the sample good enough? Have there been errors in collection and analysis? And there's lots of areas for human error to creep in too. You know, if you're doing the PCR process and the electrophoresis process, is everything going to go right so you can compare it to the sample? And it's also expensive. Thank you.